"If you want her, Richard, then don't pretend you still have me," I said, and he didn't even look up from his wine glass. That was the moment I realized my 42-year marriage had already ended long before that evening, long before the silence between us grew louder than any argument we'd ever had. Emily stood by the kitchen doorway, her hands folded politely, her eyes lowered just enough to look innocent, but not enough to hide the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had already won. She was 30 years younger than me, with steady hands and a soft voice that made everything sound harmless, even when it wasn't. I had hired her myself 6 months ago, after my arthritis made it harder to keep up with the house, thinking I was bringing help into our home, not a replacement into my life. Richard cleared his throat, finally setting his glass down with a soft clink against the mahogany table we had picked out together decades ago. "Margaret," he said in that calm, measured tone he used when he had already made up his mind, "you're overthinking this." I nodded slowly, folding my napkin with careful precision, smoothing out the corners like it still mattered. "Of course," I replied. "I always do." I stood up before either of them could say another word, before I could give them the satisfaction of seeing anything break across my face. I walked past Emily, catching the faint scent of lavender on her sweater, a scent I knew wasn't hers, because I had bought that exact same brand years ago. It lingered in the air behind me as I climbed the stairs, each step steady, measured, controlled. Inside our bedroom, the one that had held every version of our life together, I reached for my coat hanging neatly by the closet door. It was a long wool coat, charcoal gray, something practical I had worn through more winters than I could count. My fingers lingered on the fabric for just a second longer than necessary. There were things in that coat that mattered, things no one else had paid attention to. Downstairs, I could hear faint laughter, soft and low, like a conversation already moving on without me. I slipped the coat over my shoulders, feeling its familiar weight settle around me, grounding me in a way nothing else did anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I simply walked out of the room, down the stairs, past the two people who thought they had quietly rewritten my place in this house. Richard didn't stop me. Emily didn't speak. And that told me everything I needed to know. I stepped outside into the cold evening air, pulling the coat tighter around me as the wind brushed against my face. Across the street, a woman sat on the bench near the bus stop, wrapped in a thin sweater, her hands tucked under her arms for warmth. I walked toward her without thinking, or maybe I had been thinking about this moment longer than I realized. When I reached her, I paused for just a second, then slipped the coat off my shoulders and draped it gently around hers. She looked up at me, surprised, her eyes wide, searching my face for a reason. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for anything in return. "You need it more than I do," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the coat behind, leaving everything behind, not knowing that by the next morning, that simple act would unravel everything Richard thought he had secured, and everything Emily believed she had taken from me. I did not go back inside that night, not even once, not even when the porch light flickered behind me and I knew, without turning around, that Richard had finally noticed I was gone. Instead, I walked 3 blocks down Maple Street, past the houses that all looked the same in the dark, past the mailbox I had painted every spring for 20 years, until I reached the small diner on the corner that stayed open all night. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped in, and the warmth inside wrapped around me like something I had almost forgotten existed. I slid into a booth by the window, my hands resting calmly on the table, as if I had been planning this exact moment for years. The waitress came over with a tired smile and a coffee pot already in her hand. "Long night?" she asked. I nodded once. "Something like that." The coffee was hot, strong, and simple. I held the mug between my palms and stared out at the empty street, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass. For the first time in a long time, I did not see confusion there. I saw clarity. Across town, in the house that had once been mine, I knew Richard would be pacing by now, checking his phone, maybe even calling my name in that careful voice he used when he did not want to sound worried. Emily would be there too, standing just behind him, offering calm suggestions, pretending concern, positioning herself exactly where she needed to be. But there was one thing neither of them understood. They thought everything important was still inside that house. They were wrong. The coat I had given away was not just something to keep warm. Inside the inner lining, stitched carefully where no one would ever think to look, was a small envelope I had placed there weeks ago, long before I had proof of anything, back when I only had a feeling that something in my life was shifting in a way I could not control. Inside that envelope were copies of documents that mattered more than anything Richard believed he owned. Not the obvious ones. Not the accounts he checked every morning or the files he kept locked in his office drawer. These were older, quieter things. Property records. Legal agreements. A letter written in his own handwriting 15 years ago, signed and notarized, something he had forgotten because it had never been important to him. But it had always been important to me. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth settle in my chest. I had not acted out of anger. I had acted out of preparation. There is a difference, and it is one most people do not recognize until it is too late. Around midnight, my phone buzzed for the first time. I glanced down at the screen. Richard. I did not answer. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. Then again. I turned the phone face down on the table and let the silence return. It was not my responsibility to ease his discomfort. That role had ended the moment he decided I was replaceable. Somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, I finished my coffee and ordered another, not because I needed it, but because I was not ready to leave just yet. The diner filled. Slowly with the quiet rhythm of late-night life. A truck driver at the counter. A young couple speaking in low voices. Ordinary people, moving through their own stories, unaware that mine had just changed direction entirely. By the time the sky began to lighten, I stood up, placed a few bills on the table, and walked back out into the cold morning air. I did not go home. Instead, I walked toward the bus stop across from the park, the same one where I had left the coat the night before. The bench was empty now. The woman was gone. And so was the coat. I stood there for a moment, my hands tucked into the pockets of my sweater, feeling the crisp air against my skin. This was the part most people would call a risk. I did not. Called it trust. Because sometimes the only way to change everything is to let go of the one thing everyone else assumes you are still holding on to. And somewhere out there, walking through the city wrapped in that coat, was the key to everything Richard thought he had secured, and everything Emily believed she had quietly taken from me. I checked my watch, then turned toward the street just as my phone buzzed again. But this time the name on the screen was not Richard. It was someone else entirely, someone who should not have had my number, someone who should not even have known I existed, and yet somehow they did. I answered this time, lifting the phone to my ear without hesitation. "Mrs. Collins?" the voice asked, calm and precise. "Yes," I replied. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to shift the air around me. "I believe I have something that belongs to you." I did not ask how they found me because I already knew the answer would not matter nearly as much as what came next, so instead I said, "Where are you?" And the voice on the other end gave me an address just a few blocks away, a small law office I recognized but had not stepped into in years, not since Richard had insisted we move all our affairs to someone he trusted more, someone younger, someone easier to manage. And I remember agreeing at the time because that was what I had always done. I had agreed, I had adjusted, I had made things easier for him without ever asking what that cost me. But this time was different. This time I was not being invited as a wife, I was being summoned as something else entirely, and I walked there slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel every step of the distance I had already put between myself and the life I had left behind. The morning air was colder now, sharper, and by the time I reached the glass door with the brass handle, I felt completely awake in a way I had not felt in years. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, the kind of smile people give when they do not yet realize they are about to become part of something much larger than themselves. "Mrs. Collins?" she asked, and I nodded once, and she gestured toward a door already slightly open down the hallway. I did not hesitate. I walked straight to it and pushed it wider, and there, sitting behind a desk, with my coat folded neatly in front of him, was a man I had not seen in nearly a decade. "Margaret," he said, standing up slowly, his expression calm but not surprised, as if he had been expecting this exact moment long before I ever did. "It has been a long time." I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me, my eyes moving immediately to the coat, to the precise way it had been handled, not carelessly, not hastily, but with attention, with understanding. "You found it," I said, my voice steady, and he gave a small nod. "It was brought in early this morning by a woman who said someone gave it to her last night," he replied. She was kind enough to check the inner pocket when she felt something unusual stitched into the lining, and even kinder to bring it here when she saw the documents inside. I allowed myself a brief pause, just enough to acknowledge the quiet chain of decisions that had led the coat from my shoulders to this desk, to this moment. "And you opened it?" I said, not as a question but as a statement. He held my gaze without flinching. "I did, because your name was on every page and because what I found inside changes more than just a misunderstanding between a husband and a wife." I moved closer to the desk, my hands resting lightly on the back of the chair across from him, not sitting yet, not claiming comfort in a space that was not mine. "Tell me," I said, and he reached for the envelope, opening it carefully, sliding out the papers I had placed there weeks ago, papers Richard had not thought about in years, papers he had dismissed as outdated, irrelevant, signed during a time when he still believed in permanence. "This," the man said, tapping the top document gently, "is a binding agreement transferring primary ownership of the Maple Street property solely to you, executed and notarized 15 years ago, with no expiration clause and no amendments filed since." I watched his finger rest on the page, on Richard's signature, clear and undeniable. "He forgot," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and the man nodded. "Most people forget the documents they sign. When life is easy, they only remember when those documents begin to matter again." He continued, sliding another paper forward. "And this is a letter of intent, written in his own hand, confirming that in the event of any marital separation, voluntary or otherwise, the property and its contents remain under your sole control." I exhaled slowly, not out of relief but out of recognition. Everything I had prepared, everything I had quietly secured, was now exactly where it needed to be, outside of Richard's reach, outside of Emily's influence. "He believes the house is his," I said, finally taking the seat across from the desk, and the man gave a faint, almost sympathetic smile. "Then he is about to learn something very different," he replied, folding the documents back into the envelope with careful precision. "The question is not whether these hold up, they do, the question is what you intend to do with them." I looked at the coat resting between us, at the simple fabric that had carried everything that mattered out of that house without a single word, without a single confrontation, and I said, "I am not going back to explain anything." And for the first time the man's expression shifted slightly, not surprised but impressed. "You do not have to," he said. "In fact, it will be far more effective if you do not." I nodded once, understanding exactly what he meant, because silence had always been underestimated, and this time it would be the loudest thing of all. And somewhere across town, in a house that no longer belonged to him, Richard was still standing exactly where I had left him, believing he had chosen a new life, unaware that the ground beneath that life had already begun to disappear. I left the office with the envelope back in my hands, but I did not feel the weight of it the way I might have years ago, because it was no longer something I needed to protect. It was something that had already done its job, and as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the morning had fully arrived, people moving past me with their routines intact, coffee cups in hand, briefcases swinging at their sides, unaware that somewhere just a few blocks away, a life built over 4 decades was quietly shifting ownership without a single raised voice, and I found that strangely fitting, because nothing about what had happened to me had been loud. It had all been quiet, gradual, almost polite in its cruelty, and I had matched it in the same language, not with confrontation but with preparation. I walked without rushing, turning down the familiar street that led toward the house, not because I intended to go back inside, but because I wanted to see it one more time with clear eyes, without illusion, without memory softening the edges. And when I reached the corner, I stopped, standing across the street, looking at the front door that had once opened for me without question, the windows that had framed every season of my life, and I noticed something immediately. The curtains were different, lighter, newer, not something I would have chosen, and I understood then that they had already begun changing things, small things first, details that seem insignificant until they are not, until they become proof that you have already been replaced before you ever leave. A car pulled into the driveway, and I recognized it as Richard's, but what caught my attention was not him stepping out of the driver's seat. It was Emily walking around from the passenger side, holding a set of keys I knew had once belonged to me, keys I had placed in the same ceramic dish by the door every night for years. She laughed at something he said, a light, easy sound, and he smiled back in a way I had not seen in a long time, not because he had changed, but because he believed he had gained something new, something easier, something less complicated, and I stood there watching. Not with anger, not with jealousy, but with a kind of quiet clarity that made everything sharper, more defined. This was not about love, it had not been for a long time. This was about convenience, about control, about choosing what required less effort. And for years I had made everything effortless for him. I had managed the house, the finances, the small details he never noticed, and in doing so, I had made it easy for him to forget what I was actually holding together. I turned away before they could see me, not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing left to witness. Everything that needed to be understood had already revealed itself. I walked to the park just beyond the street, the same place where children played in the afternoons and where I used to sit with a book on quiet Sundays, and I took a seat on the bench, letting the sun settle lightly on my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to look backward, not with regret, but with precision. I remembered the day Richard signed those documents, the way he had laughed about legal formalities, calling them unnecessary, something his attorney insisted on. I remembered how I had read every line carefully, how I had asked questions he brushed aside, how I had kept copies of everything even when he said it was not needed, not because I expected betrayal, but because I understood something he never did, that stability is not something you assume, it is something you secure piece by piece. Quietly, consistently, and as the memory settled, I realized that what he saw as my silence all these years was not weakness. It was attention, it was awareness, it was the slow accumulation of understanding that had led me exactly to this moment. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not need to look to know it was him. The rhythm had become familiar overnight, persistent, increasingly urgent. I let it ring once, then again, then I reached into my bag and turned it off completely. The silence that followed was not empty, it was deliberate, it was mine, and I sat there for a while longer, watching the movement of the day begin, feeling the steady calm that comes when there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to fix, and nothing left to negotiate, because the decision had already been made, not in words, not in arguments, but in actions that could not be undone. And somewhere behind me, in a house that no longer belonged to him, Richard was beginning to realize that something was not where he expected it to be. Not the papers, not the control, not even the certainty he had relied on. And for the first time, he would have to face something unfamiliar, not conflict, not confrontation, but absence, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply leaves, taking everything that ever held things together with it, and does not come back. By mid-morning, I knew he had started to understand, not everything, but enough to feel the shift beneath his feet, because there is a moment when certainty begins to crack, and it does not announce itself loudly, it comes in small, unsettling questions that do not have immediate answers, and I imagined him standing in his office, opening drawers that had always contained exactly what he expected, flipping through folders with growing impatience, checking the same places twice as if repetition might restore what was missing. Emily would be nearby, of course, watching him carefully, measuring his reactions, adjusting her tone to match whatever she thought he needed in that moment, calm if he was frustrated, concerned if he was confused, always positioning herself as the solution to a problem she did not yet fully understand. And that was the difference between us. She was reacting, I had already prepared. I stood from the bench and began walking again, not toward the house but toward the bank 3 blocks down, the one Richard had stopped using years ago when he moved everything to larger accounts with advisors and assistants. But I had kept this one quietly, a smaller place, local, familiar, the kind of place where people remembered your name without needing to check a screen. The bell on the door chimed softly as I entered, and the manager looked up with recognition that had not faded with time. "Mrs. Collins," he said, standing from behind the counter. "It has been a while." I smiled politely. The kind of smile that does not reveal anything beyond what is necessary. "I have been meaning to come by," I replied, and he gestured toward his office without hesitation. We sat across from each other, and I placed the envelope on the desk between us, not dramatically, not as a reveal, but simply as the next logical step in a process that had already been set in motion. "I need to finalize a few things," I said, and he nodded, opening the envelope carefully, his eyes scanning the documents with the quiet focus of someone who understands exactly what he is looking at. "These are still valid," he said after a moment, glancing up at me with a hint of something like respect. "More than valid," I replied. "They are active." He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering. "Then you are well within your rights to proceed," he said, and I nodded once because this was never about permission, it was about execution. "I would like to transfer all associated accounts and ensure that any access previously granted is immediately revoked," I said, my voice steady, my tone even, and he did not question it. He simply reached for his computer, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "This will take a few hours to fully process," he explained. "But I can initiate everything now." I watched as he worked, not with impatience but with a quiet sense of completion, because each step he took was not creating something new. It was restoring something that had always been mine. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had changed, cars passing, people moving. The ordinary rhythm of a world that does not pause for personal revelations. And inside that office, with the soft hum of a computer and the steady click of keys, my life shifted into its final alignment. My phone, still off in my bag, remained silent, and I knew that silence was growing heavier on the other end, because Richard would have called again, more than once, each time expecting a response, each time receiving none, and eventually, he would move beyond calls. He would begin asking questions, contacting people, trying to piece together what he could not see. But by then, the answers would no longer be in his control. "It is done," the manager said finally, turning the screen slightly toward me, not because I needed to see it, but because it confirmed what had already been decided. "Everything is now under your sole authorization." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without emotion, because there was nothing left to feel about it. This was not victory, it was resolution. I stood, gathering the envelope, though it felt lighter now, almost unnecessary. "Thank you," I said. And he gave a small nod, the kind that carries understanding without requiring explanation. As I stepped back out onto the street, I reached into my bag and turned my phone on, not out of urgency, but because the timing was now appropriate. The screen lit up instantly with missed calls, messages stacked one after another, each one more direct than the last. I scrolled past them without opening a single one, and then, as if the moment had been waiting for me, the phone rang again, his name. Filling the screen, I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, lifting it to my ear with the same calm I had carried through everything else. There was no greeting on his end, just a breath, sharp and uneven, followed by my name. "Margaret," he said, and I could hear it then, not anger, not authority but uncertainty, something unfamiliar in his voice, something he had never needed before. "Where are you?" he asked, and I looked down the street, at the movement of a day that no longer included him in the way it once had, and I answered simply, "Not where you think I am," and I ended the call before he could say anything else, because for the first time it was not my role to explain it. Was his to understand, and understanding I knew would come slowly, one missing piece at a time, until there was nothing left for him to hold on to except the realization that everything he thought was secure had already been quietly, completely, and irrevocably taken out of his hands. I did not wait for him to call again because I already knew he would, and I also knew that each call would sound different from the last, shifting from confusion to urgency, from urgency to frustration, and eventually to something far less familiar to him, something quieter and heavier, something closer to realization, and I had no intention of interrupting that process because for the first time in our entire marriage, he needed to arrive at understanding on his own, without me guiding him. There, without me softening what he was about to face, I walked down the street with no particular destination, letting the rhythm of my steps settle into something steady and unhurried, and as I moved, I became aware of how light everything felt. Not because my life had become easier, but because it had become clear. There is a difference between carrying weight and carrying confusion, and I had set one of those down completely, somewhere behind me, along with the coat, along with the house, along with the version of myself that had spent years making space for someone who no longer deserved it. I stopped at a small cafe I had not visited in years, a place with wide windows and simple wooden tables, the kind of place that does not ask questions, only offers time. I ordered tea this time, something softer, something that required patience, and I sat near the window watching people pass by without recognizing me, which felt right because I was no longer standing in the role they might have expected. I was not someone's wife waiting to be acknowledged. I was simply someone who had stepped out of a life that no longer belonged to her. And for a while, I allowed myself to sit in that space, not filling it, not rushing it, just letting it exist. My phone remained on the table in front of me, silent now, which told me more than the missed calls had earlier. Silence from him meant he had moved past calling and into action. He would be at the house, going through rooms, opening cabinets, checking the safe, the office, every place he believed control lived, and Emily would be there, watching him unravel piece by piece, offering suggestions that grew less certain with each passing minute. Because she would begin to understand something she had not considered before, that what she thought she had stepped into was not stable. It had only appeared that way because I had been holding it together. And without me, things did not remain as they were, they shifted, they exposed themselves, They revealed the structure underneath, and that structure was not hers to claim. I took a slow sip of tea and let the warmth settle in my chest, remembering the first time I had noticed the change in Richard. Not dramatic, not obvious, just small adjustments, a different tone, a shorter patience, a subtle redirection of attention, things that could be explained away individually, but together formed a pattern I could not ignore, and instead of confronting it, I had observed it, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because confrontation demands immediate answers, and I was not interested in answers that could be shaped in the moment. I wanted truth, the kind that reveals itself over time, the kind that cannot be denied when it finally stands on its own, and now it had, completely without resistance. My phone lit up again, not with a call this time, but with a message I glanced down at the screen and read it once slowly. Margaret, we need to talk. Something is wrong with the accounts. Call me back. I did not respond, not because I was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left to discuss in the way he meant. He was still speaking from a place where he believed conversation could restore balance, could reestablish something that had already shifted permanently, but I had moved beyond that point. I set the phone aside and finished my tea, taking my time because time was no longer something I had to give away. When I stood to leave, I paused for just a moment, looking at my reflection in the glass, not searching for something lost, but recognizing something found, a version of myself that had always been there, beneath the roles, beneath the expectations, beneath the quiet adjustments I had made for years without question. And as I stepped outside, I felt it fully, not as a sudden change but as a return, and somewhere across town, in a house that no longer belonged to him, Richard was beginning to understand that what he thought was a temporary absence was in fact a complete removal, not just of me, but of everything that had ever made his life function. The way he expected, and Emily, standing in that same space, would be realizing something even more unsettling, that she had not replaced me. She had simply stepped into the moment right before everything disappeared. By the time the afternoon settled into that quiet, almost suspended kind of light, I knew the shift had fully taken hold, not just in documents or accounts, but in the way the entire situation had begun to unfold without me needing to touch it again. Because once the right pieces are moved into place, the rest does not require force, it follows its own logic, and I found myself walking again, not out of restlessness, but because movement made the clarity sharper. Each step reinforcing what I had already chosen. My phone remained silent for a long stretch, and that silence told me more than any message could. It meant Richard had stopped asking and had started discovering, and discovery, unlike suspicion, does not allow for denial. It builds slowly, one undeniable fact at a time, until there is no version of the story left that protects you. I turned onto a quieter street lined with older homes, the kind that hold decades of memory behind simple facades. And I wondered briefly how many of those homes carried stories like mine, hidden beneath routine, waiting for the moment they would no longer hold together. I stopped at a small bookstore I used to visit years ago, stepping inside more out of instinct than intention. The scent of paper and wood greeted me immediately, familiar and grounding. I ran my fingers lightly along the spines of books I did not need to read, just appreciating the stillness, the order, the quiet structure of something that made sense, and then my phone vibrated once against the inside of my bag. Not a call this time, not even a message from him, but a notification from the bank, simple, direct, confirming that all changes had been completed successfully, that all previous access had been removed, that everything was now exactly where it should be. I read it once, then slipped the phone back into my bag without reaction because this was not news, it was confirmation, and confirmation does not require emotion, it only requires acknowledgement. I stepped back outside, and as I did, I saw his car pull up at the curb across the street, abrupt, slightly off-center, the way people park when they are no longer thinking clearly, and for a moment I simply stood there, not surprised, not unprepared, just aware. Richard stepped out quickly, his movements sharper than I had seen in years, his eyes scanning the street until they found me, and when they did, something in his expression shifted, not relief, not quite, but recognition of something he could no longer control. He crossed the street toward me, each step carrying the weight of questions he had not yet formed into words, and when he stopped a few feet away, there was a brief pause, the kind that separates what someone expects to say from what they actually can. Margaret, he said finally, and my name sounded different now, stripped of assumption, edged with uncertainty. I met his gaze without stepping back, without stepping forward, simply standing where I was, because this was no longer a conversation between two people sharing the same ground, this was something else entirely. What did you do? he asked, not accusing, not yet, but searching, and I answered him with the same calm I had carried through everything else. I finished something I started a long time ago. He shook his head slightly, as if the words did not fit the situation he was trying to understand. The accounts are locked, the house documents, they are not where they should be, he continued, and I could see it now, the realization beginning to take shape behind his eyes, incomplete but undeniable. They are exactly where they should be, I replied, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the air between us steady, unbroken. He glanced back toward his car, as if expecting someone else to step out, to offer explanation, to restore the version of reality he had been relying on, but no one did because this was not something anyone else could fix for him. You cannot just disappear and take everything with you, he said, and there it was, not anger, not yet, but the first trace of something closer to it, something born from the loss of control rather than the loss of me, and I let that settle for a second before answering. I did not take anything that was not already mine. His jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance but in adjustment, as if he was recalculating everything he thought he knew. We need to sit down and talk about this, he said, the word need carrying the weight of habit, of expectation, of a dynamic that no longer existed, and I shook my head once, not dismissively, not harshly, just clearly. No, I said, and that single word held more finality than anything I could have explained, because explanation would have given him something to work with, something to respond to, and I was no longer offering that. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me without the layers that had once defined my place in his life, and for the first time I saw it, the understanding beginning to settle, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to change the direction of everything that came next. And as I turned to walk away, I did not look back, not because I needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to me anymore. And somewhere in that quiet space between us, what had once been assumed to be permanent had finally revealed itself as something far more fragile, something that could be undone without a single raised voice, simply by removing the one person who had been holding it together all along. The sound of my own footsteps felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just deliberate, each step carrying a certainty that no longer depended on anyone else's reaction. And as I moved down the street, I did not need to turn around to know he was still standing there, trying to understand a version of events that no longer centered around him, because for years everything had, every decision, every adjustment, every quiet compromise had been shaped to fit his comfort. And now, without warning, that center had shifted, and he did not know how to stand in a world where he was no longer at it. I reached the end of the block and paused briefly at the corner, the traffic light changing in slow, predictable rhythm, a contrast to the disruption unfolding behind me. And I realized something then. Something simple but final. I was not walking away from something. I was walking towards something that had been waiting for me for a very long time. A life that did not require explanation, did not require permission, did not require me to make myself smaller so someone else could remain comfortable. My phone vibrated again in my hand, but this time I did not look at it immediately. I let it ring once, then again, letting the moment settle before acknowledging it. When I finally glanced down, the name on the screen was not Richard, it was Emily, and for a brief second I considered ignoring it entirely, because her role in all of this was not central, not in the way she believed. She was not the cause, she was simply the outcome of something that had already been weakening long before she arrived. But I answered anyway, not out of obligation but out of curiosity. Margaret, she said, her voice controlled, carefully measured. But there was something beneath it now, something less certain than before. I think there has been a misunderstanding. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing but because it was predictable. There has not, I replied, my tone even giving her nothing to work with. There was a pause on the other end, longer this time, as if she was recalculating her approach. Richard is very upset, she continued, shifting the focus away from herself, positioning him as the center again, as if that would restore balance, but it did not. That is something he will have to manage, I said, and again I did not raise my voice, I did not rush, I simply placed the responsibility exactly where it belonged. There was another pause, and when she spoke again, the control in her voice had thinned slightly. You cannot just take everything and leave like this, she said, and there it was, not concern, not confusion but expectation, the belief that what I had done was outside the structure she thought she had stepped into, and I answered her the same way I had answered him. I did not take anything that was not already mine. Silence followed, but it was different now, heavier, less certain, and I knew she was beginning to understand something she had not accounted for, that she had not replaced me. She had stepped into a situation already in motion, one that did not revolve around her, one that would not adjust itself to accommodate her presence. "What do you want?" she asked finally, and the question itself revealed everything, because it assumed this was a negotiation, that there was something I was trying to gain, something I was willing to exchange, and I let that sit for a moment before answering. "Nothing," I said, and I meant it, not in the way people say it when they are hiding something, but in the way that comes when there is truly nothing left to ask for, nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim. She did not respond immediately, and when she did, her voice had changed again, quieter now, less certain. "Then what happens next?" she asked, and I looked ahead at the street stretching in front of me, open, unclaimed, and I answered without hesitation. "That depends on what you both do without me." I ended the call before she could say anything else, not because I needed the last word, but because there was nothing left to add. And as I slipped the phone back into my bag, I understood something with complete clarity. This was the part no one prepares for. Not the moment of confrontation, not the moment of discovery, but the moment after, when everything has already shifted and there is no clear script for what comes next. And that is where most people try to go back, try to restore something familiar, but I had no intention of doing that. I continued walking, the city moving around me in its usual rhythm, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt aligned with that movement, not resisting it, not adjusting myself to fit into something that no longer worked, but simply moving forward, and somewhere behind me, in a house that no longer belonged to him, and in a life that no longer included me, Richard and Emily were left standing in the space I had vacated, surrounded by the structure they believed was stable, only now beginning to understand that stability had never belonged to them. It had only ever been something I had quietly maintained, and without me, it would not hold. The evening settled in slowly, not with drama, not with noise, but with the kind of quiet that follows a day where something irreversible has already taken place, and I found myself standing at the edge of the river just outside the city, watching the water move in a steady, uninterrupted current, the surface reflecting the fading light in a way that felt almost too calm for everything that had shifted beneath it, and I realized then that this was what it looked like when something truly ended. Not with confrontation, not with final words spoken in anger, but with a quiet, undeniable separation that no longer needed explanation. I leaned lightly against the railing, my hands resting there without tension, without urgency, simply present, and for the first time in years, there was nothing pressing against my thoughts. No need to anticipate someone else's reaction, no need to adjust my words before speaking them, no need to consider how my choices might disrupt someone else's expectations. There was only stillness, and within that stillness, clarity. My phone remained silent in my bag, and I knew why, because there comes a point when repeated attempts to regain control give way to something else, something quieter, something closer to acceptance, and I imagined Richard sitting in that house, not pacing anymore, not calling, but sitting, looking at the space around him with a different understanding, noticing the absence not just of me but of the structure that had held everything together. The small things that do not announce themselves until they are gone, the order, the rhythm, the quiet consistency that makes a life feel stable without ever demanding recognition. And Emily, somewhere in that same space, would be feeling it too, not as a clear realization, not yet, but as a growing discomfort, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in a way she could not correct, because she had stepped into something she did not build, something she did not understand, something that no longer existed in the form she expected. I straightened slightly and looked out over the water, the current moving forward without hesitation, without looking back, and I understood then that this was not just an ending, it was a release, not from him, not even from the marriage itself, but from the version of myself that had remained in a place long after it had stopped being mine. I had not been pushed out, not really. I had stepped away deliberately, completely, and in doing so, I had taken with me everything that had ever made that life function. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of truth, because those things had always been mine to carry, and mine to remove. I turned away from the river and began walking again, not toward anything specific but forward, and as I moved, I felt it settle fully, the absence of hesitation, the absence of doubt, the absence of anything that required me to look back, and in that absence, there was something else, something steady, something quiet but undeniable, something that had been there all along, waiting beneath years of adjustment and compromise, and as I reached the end of the path, I paused just long enough to take one final breath of the cool evening air, and I allowed myself a single simple acknowledgement, not spoken aloud, not dramatic, just clear. I had not lost anything that was truly mine. I had only stopped holding on to what was never meant to remain, and somewhere behind me, in a life that no longer included me, They would continue trying to understand what had happened, trying to reconstruct something that could not be rebuilt in the same way, but I would not be part of that process. I would not return to explain, to justify, or to soften what had already been set in motion, because this was not a story about what I left behind, it was a story about what I chose to carry forward. And as I walked into the quiet of the night, there was only one thing left that mattered. Not what they had taken, not what they had lost, but what I had finally reclaimed: myself.